I, for one, when a white man comes to me and tells me how liberal he is, the first thing I want to know, is he a nonviolent liberal or the other kind? I don't go for any nonviolent white liberal. If you are for me, and my problem, when I say me, I mean us, our people, then you have to be willing to do as old John Brown did. And if you're not of the John Brown school of white liberals, we'll get you later. Later.
Welcome to Truman's Pod.
Hello and welcome to Proles Pod, your bi-weekly dose of history, politics, and culture without the liberalism. You can find and follow us on most social media platforms at Proles Pod and on TikTok at proles.pod. If you want to help us reach more people, leaving 5-star reviews on any of the various podcast catchers is the best way to do that. If you want to help us with our vision, you can subscribe to our Patreon over at patreon.com/prolespod. There's a lot of great stuff there, such as early access to main feed episodes, bonus episodes, theory beats, study guides, raffles, surprise drops, and more, with more on the way. This episode is brought to you by our excellent patrons on Patreon. Today we have the honor of being joined by Alex Zambito, who goes by Southern Catholic Worker on Instagram and on social media, to give us a 2-part in-depth rundown followed by a discussion on John Brown. Each part of this duology will begin with a narrative written and read by Alex, followed by a discussion between Alex, myself, Tony, your favorite host, and Jeremy. So Alex, before we get started, can you kind of give us some background to who you are and the work that you do?
So I am the Southern Catholic Worker on Instagram, which is kind of like where I focus on like doing propaganda work just for, building hopefully a revolutionary consciousness and class consciousness. And currently like in what I do more day to day is I live at the Catholic Worker in New York, which is a community that runs a house of hospitality on the Lower East Side. So every day we just have like a little soup line where guys can come in, eat, get to talk to each other, and just kind of share like some hospitality with the people that are there. And those are the main activities that I'm involved in.
Awesome. Thanks for that introduction, Alex. So from now we're going to go into the narrative.
John Brown was born on May 9th, 1800 in Torrington, Connecticut, to Owen and Ruth Brown. He was of thorough Puritan stock and believed he could trace his lineage on his father's side back to the carpenter Peter Brown, who came over on the Mayflower. In 1805, the family moved to Hudson, Ohio, which was a small frontier township, with white people being a very small minority in the area, which was predominantly populated by indigenous tribes. Family tragedy, something he would become very familiar with later on, struck when his mother died in childbirth in 1808, which devastated the young John. His father soon married a woman named Sally Root, who John Brown respected but never, quote-unquote, adopted in feeling. John Brown was deeply influenced by his father and his childhood in Ohio. First, Owen Brown was a devout Calvinist and was particularly devoted to a preacher named Jonathan Edwards, who emphasized the absolute sovereignty of God's power to determine everything. Like his father, John Brown revered the preacher, but he would be more devoted to Edwards' son, Jonathan Edwards Jr., who, if anything, had an even more severe interpretation of Christianity. We'll get to know John Brown's strict Calvinist views as we go on. Next was the Brown family's vehement abolitionism, which was steeped in their Calvinist faith. Jonathan Edwards Jr. himself railed against slavery, proclaiming, quote, "To hold any man in slavery is to be every day guilty of robbing him of his liberty, or of man-stealing," unquote. Most importantly, John's parents taught him the golden rule, do unto others as you would have done unto you, applied to everyone, regardless of race. One phrase Brown uses a lot is, quote, God is no respecter of persons. This comes from Acts of the Apostles 10:34, where the Apostle Peter says it about a Roman centurion, Cornelius, who asked Peter to teach him about the scriptures, which was against Jewish law. Here, Peter means that the word of God is meant for everyone, without partiality. Similarly, God does not show any favoritism to any person based on race, wealth, etc., but loves all humans equally. Beyond his father's abolitionism, John Brown determined from a young age that slavery was evil when he observed the treatment of a young slave boy. In a letter he wrote to Henry Stearns, one of the sons of his future supporter, George Stearns, he explained how, when he was a young boy, he stayed for a short time with a quote-unquote gentlemanly landlord, who owned a slave boy near his own age, who Brown was quite fond of for his intelligence and kindness. John was disturbed by the clear preferential treatment he received from his host, who praised John for his intelligence and ability to tend cattle. Meanwhile, the slave boy, who Brown believed was his equal, if not superior, was treated harshly by his master. He was poorly clothed, beaten with iron shovels, and forced to sleep out in the cold. Reflecting on this caused Brown to, quote, declare or swear eternal war with slavery, unquote. Another lesson John learned that will appear later on in his life is how his father treated indigenous tribes. The section of Ohio the Brown family lived in was mostly populated by indigenous tribes, including the Senecas, the Oneidas, the Chippewas, the Ottawas, the Onondagas, and the Mingos. Unlike other settlers in the area who viewed indigenous peoples as enemies who needed to be conquered and Christianized, Owen Brown and his family viewed them as fellow people who the Golden Rule applied to as much as any other people. As Owen Brown explained, quote, when we came to Ohio, the Indians were more numerous than the white people, but were very friendly, and I believe were a benefit rather than an injury. There were some persons that seemed disposed to quarrel with the Indians, but I never had, unquote. The Browns formed a mutually beneficial relationship with neighboring tribes, trading with them and offering hospitality. All of this added up to a multicultural upbringing for Brown, which was reflected in how he lived his life. We'll see how this shaped Brown's vision of equality and how his progressive views on other races, which were unique even among abolitionists. For much of his early life, John Brown would work for his father's tannery until he decided to go into business for himself, opening his own tannery close to Hudson. As we'll see, John Brown was not a good businessman. He was generally too forthright and honest to succeed in a commercial environment filled with speculation and snake oil salesmen, which were rampant in the first half of the 19th century. For example, at his tannery, he would refuse to sell any leather that was not in the perfect condition, and once hearing that a local family had become destitute, he hired on the father despite not having any open position, and gave him clothing and food as advance payment. Brown married his first wife, Dianthe, in 1820. While he greatly admired Dianthe, her family had a history of mental illness, which could at times make her behave erratically. While he was not prolific in business, John Brown was prolific in making babies. He would father 20 children with 2 different wives, and as a hint for things ahead, only 8 of these children would outlive him. His firstborn child, who Brown named after himself, was born on July 25, 1821, followed by Jason in 1823 and Owen in 1824. Brown could be an intensely strict father. He insisted on regular prayer and observation of the Sabbath. He also regularly doled out corporal punishment. He would keep an account book for his children based on their behavior and use this to decide their punishment. In one story, he took John Jr. into a barn and began whipping him with a beach switch. Once he had delivered 1/3 of the allotted blows, he gave the switch to his son, took off his shirt, and had his son deliver the remaining blows on him. It's very Calvinist. However, Brown could also be very tender and soften his parenting over time. When his first wife's health began to decline, he would regularly nurse the whole family when his children became sick. He would even stay up several days without sleep to look after his children. Later, he would relish opportunities to gather his children on his knee, sing hymns, and talk to them about national affairs. In 1825, Brown moved his family to northwestern Pennsylvania, which Brown would help to develop into the town New Richmond. Brown surveyed the land and founded the town's first post office, school, and church. Here, he would also welcome several more children. Soon, a sickly boy named Frederick was born, followed by a daughter, Ruth, in 1829, and a second Frederick in 1830. The 1830s were proved to be a trying and formative time for John Brown. In 1831, his first son, Frederick, died, followed later that year by his wife, Dianthe, who died giving birth to a son who quickly died himself. By 1833, John Brown married his second wife, Mary, and they soon welcomed a daughter named Sarah. The couple would go on to have 13 children, most of them dying before Mary. Mary was a great source of stability for John and the family, and would maintain a stoic calm even in the face of the difficulties that lie ahead. In terms of politics, Brown spent much of the 1820s as a Whig, but quickly became disgusted by the party's acceptance of slavery. Obviously, he also couldn't support the Democrats, represented by the slaveholding Andrew Jackson. So, by the 1830s, Brown was a man without a party, and likely didn't vote in any presidential elections afterward. His anti-slavery stance began to crystallize with the news of Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia in August of 1831. Turner planned a slave uprising to take over Southampton County, followed by a retreat into the mountains. Turner and his cohort moved from plantation to plantation, killing everyone inside, until 55 whites had been killed. Once whites began a pursuit, they killed untold numbers of the enslaved. Turner would evade capture for 2 months before he was apprehended hiding in a cave. He was hanged a month later with 16 black people. John Brown was inspired by slave rebellions like Nat Turner's and sought to learn from them. Brown was known to have admired the Haitian Revolution and likely knew of other revolts, like the New Orleans slave uprising in 1811 and Denmark Vesey's plan to take over Charleston, South Carolina in 1820. On the other hand, abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison were terrified of slave revolts. Garrison, while founder of the American Anti-Slavery Society, and probably the most prominent abolitionist until Lincoln, did not display the same racial openness we will see from Brown. His organization was routinely criticized for its lack of black members outside of the most prominent, like Frederick Douglass. Unlike Brown, Garrison condemned Turner's revolt and worried about the quote-unquote gigantic cannibal of enraged black people rising up in the South. Brown particularly admired the slave revolt led by an enslaved man named Cinque on the ship the Amistad. While being transported from Cuba to Spain, the enslaved broke from their bonds below deck, swarmed the ship, and killed the captain and 3 of his crew. The rebels were tricked and brought to Long Island, but they were exonerated because the slave trade had been abolished in America. 35 of the enslaved were returned to their countries. Brown was inspired because he believed slavery would have to be resisted and abolished by force, but he hoped to accomplish this without too much violence, a hope future events would dampen. This is where the difference in their anti-slavery stances began to crystallize. Brown supported the abolition of slavery by any means necessary. On the other hand, Garrison was insistent on non-resistance. He believed slavery could be ended by moral persuasion, and if this failed, he preached disunion between the North and the South. In 1835, Brown and his family returned to Ohio, with Mary giving birth to a boy named Watson within a year. He would be followed by two more sons, Salmon and Charles, in 1836 and 1837, respectively. Here, Brown tried and failed at land speculation when he bought land and a farm near Franklin Mills, Ohio. Unfortunately, his timing was bad as usual with his business instincts, and he had purchased the land at peak prices, and soon found himself in severe debt. While his financial prospects were crashing, his anti-slavery activities were prospering. In spite of steep fines for assisting fugitive slaves, Brown became a station master for the Underground Railroad. He constructed a hiding place in his barn and made nighttime rides to transport fugitive slaves north. Further, John Brown pushed back on discrimination in his personal life. Brown had hired a black couple to help on his farm, and when they attended a revival together at Franklin Congregational Church, Brown was outraged to see all of the black congregants forced to sit in the back. Brown marched to the back of the church and walked the black couple to his family seats at the front and sat in the seats in the back. He reminded everyone that God was, quote, no respecter of persons, unquote. By the latter half of the 1830s, Brown's commitment to anti-slavery activities intensified, largely in response to the intensification of pro-slavery violence. Despite denouncing Nat Turner's rebellion, William Lloyd Garrison was blamed for it anyway, and in 1835 he was swarmed by a pro-slavery mob. He was bound and pulled through the streets by a rope to cries of "Lynch him." In November of 1837, the Illinois anti-slavery newspaper editor, Elijah Lovejoy, was murdered by a mob while protecting his printing press, which had already been destroyed 3 times by mobs. Again, response to this revealed a difference between the philosophies of John Brown and other abolitionists. Garrison and his followers recoiled to greater pacifism, rejection of the political system, and the Constitution. Meanwhile, Brown heard about the incident at a prayer meeting he attended with his father, where speakers railed against slavery and its mobs. Suddenly, John Brown stood up and declared, quote, "Here, before God, in the presence of these witnesses from this time, I consecrate my life to the destruction of slavery," unquote. Unfortunately, the coming years would bring further financial difficulty and tragedy to the Brown family. Brown had a tendency to rely on credit, often borrowing from Peter to pay Paul. While his sincerity was never doubted, he frequently struggled to meet his obligations. This was not helped by his inability to stop having children. Brown fathered 3 more children, Oliver in 1839, Peter in 1840, and Austin in 1842. In 1843, tragedy struck the family when 4 children, Charles, Austin, Peter, and Sarah, died within the same month from a disease likely brought on by unsanitary conditions within the home. Salmon Brown described it as, quote, "a calamity from which father never fully recovered," unquote. They would endure a similar tragedy a few years later, in 1846, when their daughter Amelia, who had been born the year before, was scalded to death in an accident caused by Ruth. Facing these tragedies with his typical Calvinist stoicism, Brown wrote to his family, quote, "This is a bitter cup indeed, but blessed be God. A brighter day shall dawn, and let us not sorrow as those that have no hope. Try to maintain cheerful self-command while we are tossing up and down, and let our motto still be action, action, as we have but one life to live." Unquote. While afflicted with these tragedies, Brown was pursuing a new business that reveals his feelings towards capitalism. In 1844, Brown moved his family to Akron, Ohio, to partner with the wealthy Simon Perkins, who recognized Brown's talent for assessing wool. Brown was to tend Perkins' sheep and help sell the wool to northern distributors. However, Brown quickly became infuriated by what he saw as the unfair business practices of wool merchants and companies who he believed cheated farmers by paying them less than their wool was worth. Brown planned to collect farmers' wool, grade it, fix a price, then sell it to buyers at a price that reflected its value. To make this happen, Brown opened a distribution center in Springfield, Massachusetts, where he moved his family in 1847. Unfortunately, this plan would not work out, as buyers would simply buy wool elsewhere until Brown was forced to lower his prices. However, this does show that Brown was not only concerned with the well-being of the enslaved, but also cared about workers he believed were cheated. His son, John Brown Jr., who would go on to become explicitly a socialist, claimed to recognize a similar strain in his father, although this was more likely the utopian socialist variety common in America in the early 19th century. In the late 1840s, Brown bought land in North Elba, an isolated village in upstate New York, and sent his family to live there in 1849. Brown planned to open the land to settlement for free black people and fugitive slaves to prove black people and white people could live together in social equality. For instance, 3 visitors who received hospitality from the Brown family after their party got lost while hiking were surprised when they were joined by local black people for dinner at the Browns' home. Beyond simple social equality, Brown always solicited the opinions of his black comrades on what direction his actions should take. This highlights a key difference between Brown and other contemporary abolitionists, most of which would have been scandalized by Brown's respectful treatment of black people. Brown viewed himself as a servant for the cause of black people, and as such, he sought to learn from them and value their viewpoints. This is why understanding the broader currents in American politics and abolitionists is important for understanding John Brown. The general abolitionist movement was both not free of racism, and it was incredibly disunited around what to do about slavery. Many opponents didn't even believe in immediate abolition. Many in the Republican Party, like Abraham Lincoln and William Seward, believed slavery should be left alone in the states where it was currently practiced, and prevented from spreading. Slavery, they said, would eventually die out on its own. Others, like William Lloyd Garrison and his American Anti-Slavery Society, believed in the immediate abolition of slavery, but differed still on how to accomplish it. Garrison and his acolytes rejected the Constitution, the entire U.S. political system, and advocated disunion between North and South. Meanwhile, others in Garrison's abolitionist society, like the editor James Gillespie Birney, wanted to embrace politics and end slavery through voting. But no matter where they stood on these matters, what unified them was they were all racist to a certain extent. While they may have believed that black people should not be enslaved, they did not believe they should be equal to white people. Most still believed that black people were inferior to whites and should not be given equal status. Lincoln said this explicitly. One of the most popular positions among abolitionists before the war was colonizationism, which advocated returning freed black people to Africa to establish their own colonies. This was Lincoln's position well into the Civil War. Even the so-called Free Soilers in Kansas Territory, who fought to prevent Kansas from becoming a slave state, didn't do it out of any concern for black people. They wanted to block black people from coming into Kansas altogether. And vitally, One belief most of these abolitionists were united in was that black people were incapable of freeing themselves, and certainly didn't belong in any leadership positions in abolitionist organizations. Most believed, like many Southerners, that black people were inherently too docile and cowardly for a large-scale rebellion. Beyond that, even if they were temperamentally inclined to revolt, most believed black people incapable of independent mass organization and military action. John Brown not only believed in black people's ability to free themselves, he began to formulate a plan based on it. By the 1850s, he had begun to plan for his raid on Harper's Ferry. He argued, quote, "No people could have self-respect or be respected who would not fight for their freedom," unquote. Brown's plan was to invade a southern state, liberate an armed enslaved people, and retreat with them to the Appalachian Mountains, which he believed had been put there by God to help in the liberation of slaves. From there, they would establish a community where fugitive slaves could escape to, and from where armed black people could raid southern plantations. Brown based this plan on his study of black resistance. As already mentioned, Brown was inspired by slave revolts, but he was also inspired by maroon communities. These were communities established by runaway slaves who escaped to the wilderness and defended themselves using guerrilla tactics. Maroons dated back to the earliest settlement of North America. In 1526, the Spanish explorer Lucas Vázquez de Ayllón brought 100 slaves with him to South Carolina, where several escaped and joined natives in the wilderness. Similarly, slaves had escaped to Florida before it was annexed by the U.S. and supported the Seminoles in the Second Seminole War. By the time of the Civil War, 50 maroon communities had appeared in the United States. Additionally, John Brown was deeply interested in maroon communities in the West Indies, like Suriname, Jamaica, and Haiti. This history is what informed Brown's strategy and his belief that slaves would fight for their freedom. Brown was enraged by the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which he believed had been sent by God to warn white people to shed their racism and black people to prepare for armed struggle. In January of 1851, Brown formed the League of Gileadites, inspired by the story of Gideon in the Old Testament. Gideon was directed by God to defend Israel from an invading army by winnowing his army down to his bravest troops. Gideon tells his soldiers they can leave if they are scared until he is left with only 300 men. When the battle begins, Gideon's soldiers blow trumpets in unison, making a thunderous sound, generating confusion in the enemy army, who attack one another and begin deserting. Brown directed the group to resist any slave catchers through force and flee to the homes of sympathetic whites, who would either protect them or disgrace themselves. Importantly, membership in Brown's militia was not limited to just men, but allowed women to join as well. This reveals another aspect of John Brown. He was also progressive on women's issues. He regularly attended feminist lectures and supported women's suffrage. Even in his home, men and women shared tasks equally. In 1854, the federal government passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which repealed the Missouri Compromise and allowed slavery in Western territories based on popular sovereignty. This sparked a race between pro-slavery and free state settlers to the territory, which would draw 3 of Brown's sons, Owen, Frederick, and Salmon, who set up a camp outside of the town of Osawatomie, which became named Brown Station. They were followed by John Jr. and Jason the following year. Finally, after consulting his black comrades in North Elba, John Brown joined his sons in Kansas, a move that would change the course of American history. Before we get to John Brown's exploits, we need to understand the context in Kansas when he arrived there. First is the general attitude Southerners had towards slavery. At the beginning of the 19th century, most supporters of slavery would have considered it a necessary evil, in the vein of Thomas Jefferson. However, this stance began to change with the profitability and expansion of cotton cultivation due to the invention of the cotton gin. By the 1830s, figures like South Carolina Senator John C. Calhoun claimed the South's peculiar institution was a positive good for both the nation and the enslaved themselves. They claimed it not only enriched the genteel class of Southern slave owners, but also brought a civilizing influence on black people. By the 1850s, the South had built lives and entire society around slavery. In Kansas, the South saw a battlefield for the future of slavery. They believed if they won Kansas, slavery would spread to the rest of the territories, which would give slavery an outlet to bring more land under cultivation. Additionally, it would give the South more power in Congress. The South essentially began a pro-slavery crusade, with Missouri Senator David Rice Atchison inciting Missourians to enter into the state to counteract anti-slavery settlers. These men, who became known as border ruffians, illegally crossed into the state to take over election booths and cast votes for pro-slavery candidates. As Missourian General B.F. Stringfellow implored, quote, "I advise you, one and all, to enter every election district in Kansas and vote at the point of the Bowie knife and revolver," unquote. Through 1854 and 1855, these ruffians fraudulently elected a pro-slavery candidate to Congress and 39 out of 40 representatives for Kansas. These representatives organized a bogus legislature and passed so-called quote-unquote black laws protecting slavery. These mandated draconian punishments for activities like reading and distributing abolitionist publications, and even the death penalty for inducing slaves to revolt. While these laws were so extreme to be almost unenforceable, they produced a chilling effect on abolitionist activity and fostered an environment of violence. On the other hand, there was the Free State side, which was not any less racist. Most of the Free State settlers were lured there with promises of cheap land and assistance from immigrant aid societies funded by Northern businessmen. These capitalists were inspired by hopes of turning a profit in Kansas and fostering laissez-faire capitalism, not fighting slavery. And when the Free Staters established their own government in Topeka in 1855, the Constitution their convention passed included a clause that excluded black people from the territory. When the clause was voted on in a referendum, over 3/4 of the Free Staters approved it. Meanwhile, the Brown brothers had already staked their claim as thoroughgoing abolitionists. When one group of armed border ruffians came upon Brown Station, they inquired into the brothers' political views, to which John Jr. responded, quote, "We are Free State, and more than that, we are abolitionists," unquote. On another occasion, John Jr. broke the state's new laws when he told a slave owner that no man had any right to own another in Kansas. He vowed he would kill any officer that tried to arrest him for it. The Browns were not unreasonable to bare their teeth. Pro-slavery settlers had already displayed a penchant for violent intimidation and reprisal. In 1854, a pro-slavery committee ordered the Free State lawyer William Phelps to leave Kansas. When he refused, he was arrested and taken to Missouri, where he was tarred and feathered, ridden on a rail, and sold for $1 in a mock auction. Phillips would defiantly re-enter Kansas, but he was later killed. When a shootout over a land dispute was attributed to violence over slavery, it triggered Southern outrage, an attempted assault on the Free State town of Lawrence. A pro-slavery sheriff named Samuel J. Jones requested a militia from Kansas Governor Wilson Shannon, and Shannon acquiesced, launching the Wakarusa War. A force of about 1,200 pro-slavery troops, composed mostly of Missouri border ruffians, who quickly became intoxicated and rowdy, gathered south of Lawrence, prepared to sack the town. John Brown and his sons quickly made an overnight march to the town, where they were greeted by the news of the murder of unarmed Free Stater Thomas Barber by an armed band of border ruffians. The Browns immediately set out to help with fortifications, and John Brown was appointed a captain by Free State leader Charles Robinson. Fortunately for the town of Lawrence, Free State leaders and Governor Shannon were able to reach a compromise that averted the battle, with Shannon agreeing not to enforce any of the state's black laws. On January 5, 1856, John Brown served as the chairman of the Osawatomie Free State Convention that selected candidates for the state office, of which John Jr. was one. 10 days later, during the election, violence erupted again, as Free State leader Reese P. Brown, no relation, was hacked to death in the doorway of his cabin by hatchets and knives. Much of this Southern bravado derived from the belief that Northerners and abolitionists were unwilling to fight. This was not entirely off base. The most outspoken abolitionists of the day were committed to non-resistance and explicitly opposed the use of force to end slavery. On the other hand, Southerners had built a myth around their own militarism and chivalry, although this mainly disguised their penchant for lynch law and violence. Virginian politician Henry A. Wise remarked that the South could defeat the North with just the Bowie knife. In Kansas, this created an atmosphere where Southerners believed they could get away with the most crass intimidation and abuse with impunity. They had not yet met John Brown. This is where Brown began preparing for probably his most controversial act, the Pottawatomie massacre. But I would like to put this act in context. In the early months of 1856, President Franklin Pierce officially supported the pro-slavery side of Kansas. Pierce supported compromise on the slavery question, which made him a quote-unquote doughface in John Brown's book. Doughfaces were Northern politicians who too easily compromised or capitulated to the South. Pierce replaced his first territorial governor, Andrew H. Reeder, because he turned against slavery. He then appointed Wilson Shannon and blatantly ignored atrocities committed by border ruffians. Finally, he proclaimed the fraudulent pro-slavery legislature and constitution legitimate, making the actions of its opponents treason. This was followed by animosity aimed directly at the Browns. In April of 1856, pro-slavery judge Sterling G. Cato issued warrants for the arrest of John Brown and his sons. Cato held the court session in a tavern near Osawatomie, owned by Henry Sherman, a pro-slavery settler who will reappear in our story. Testing Cato, Brown sent his son Salmon and son-in-law Henry Thompson, Ruth's husband, to the court to see if they would be arrested. He planned to rescue them if they were. When the court did not arrest Salmon and Henry, John Jr. burst into the proceedings, demanding to know if the judge would actually enforce the laws. Cato insisted the court should not be disturbed, to which John Jr. marched outside and shouted, quote, "The Pottawatomie Rifle Company will meet at the parade ground," unquote. About 30 men joined, and the show of force led Cato to break up the court. Beyond direct threats to Brown and his family, pro-slavery violence increased in general. When pro-slavery sheriff Samuel J. Jones issued dubious warrants to arrest free staters, he was shot and wounded, where pro-slavery forces spread the rumor he was murdered. In retaliation, Reverend Party Butler, who had already been tied to a raft and stoned the year before, was tarred, cottoned, and left stranded in an open prairie. Following this, John Stewart was shot in the back by border ruffians, simply for telling them he was an abolitionist. When Free State men investigated the killing, Charles Lenhart was shot and killed by ruffians. When Judge S.D. Lecomte issued indictments for members of the Topeka Free State Legislature, border ruffians saw this as a justification for an assault on the Free State town of Lawrence. About 750 intoxicated border ruffians swarmed the city unchallenged and ransacked it. They inflicted over $200,000 in damages. Brown was enraged and began planning his retaliation. While sitting with his sons and allies, Brown said, quote, "Something is going to be done now. we must show by actual work that there are two sides to this thing, and that they cannot go on with impunity." Unquote. The final straw for Brown was the caning of Senator Charles Sumner by Preston Brooks. The anti-slavery senator from Massachusetts had provoked the ire of Brooks when Sumner insulted one of Brooks's relatives, South Carolina Senator Andrew P. Butler, in his speech, "The Crime Against Kansas." After the Senate session ended on May 22nd, Brooks approached Sumner at his desk while he was reading papers and struck him across the head with the gold head of his cane, repeating blows until Sumner collapsed on his desk, covered in blood. Brooks was celebrated across the South and given many gifts, including canes with inscriptions like, quote, "Hit him again," unquote. John Brown was not amused when he heard the news. When someone advised him to use caution going forward, Brown replied, quote, "Caution, caution, sir. I am eternally tired of hearing that word caution. It is nothing but the word of cowardice," unquote. The 5 men Brown killed at Pottawatomie were James Doyle, William Doyle, Drury Doyle, Allen Wilkinson, and William Sherman. All 5 were picked for their pro-slavery sympathies and their willingness to use violence to enforce the territory's bogus black laws. 3 of the men, James Doyle, William Doyle, and Allen Wilkinson, had participated in Judge Cato's bogus trial of the Browns at Dutch Henry's Crossing. This tavern was owned by the Sherman brothers, who were given the names Dutch Henry, Dutch Bill, and Dutch Pete for their German heritage. One local resident Free State judge, James Hanway, noted these men were killed in response to the rising pro-slavery violence and personal threats against the Browns. The Sherman's Tavern, Dutch Henry's Crossing, was a local center for pro-slavery activity, and the Shermans were belligerent towards any they suspected of Free State sympathies. Dutch Henry threatened to lynch a merchant who sold Jason Brown lead. He regularly terrorized Free State people, threatening to shoot and exterminate them. Meanwhile, the Doyles were members of the pro-slavery Law and Order Party, and James Doyle had threatened to kill a store owner unless he left the territory. And Wilkinson was so well known for his abuse of Free Staters that his wife frequently castigated him for potentially bringing on violent retribution. In sum, all these men wanted to see all abolitionists dead, and they had no problem doing it themselves. Early on the morning of May 23, 1856, John Brown set out with 7 comrades, his sons Frederick, Salmon, Oliver, and Owen, his son-in-law, Henry Thompson, James Townley, and Theodore Weiner. After camping in a grassy ravine, roughly 1 mile north of Dutch Henry's Crossing for the night and most of the next day, at around 10 o'clock on May 24th, Brown and his men gathered their weapons and proceeded to the area where the pro-slavery settlers lived. They began with James Doyle. The posse knocked on Doyle's door, asking for direction to Allen Wilkinson's house. When Doyle opened the door to respond, 5 men rushed in and took him prisoner. His wife cried, quote, "Haven't I told you what you were going to get for the course you have been taking?" Unquote. Brown took James Doyle and his sons William and Drury and walked them about 200 yards into the woods, where Owen and Salmon hacked them to death with broadswords. James Doyle had been shot in the head to ensure death. They then walked a half-mile to the cabin of Allen Wilkinson. After loudly knocking at Wilkinson's door, asking for directions to Dutch Henry's, the posse asked Wilkinson to step out to tell them. Once he was outside, he was surrounded by 4 men. Once Wilkinson was dressed, the men escorted him about 150 yards away from the cabin, where he was hacked to death by Henry Thompson and Theodore Weiner. His body was thrown in a dead bush. The final target was Dutch Henry. They approached the cabin of Henry's pro-slavery friend, James Harris, where they found Dutch Henry's brother, William Sherman, along with John Whitman and Jerome Glanville. Dutch Henry had gone searching for lost cattle. Dutch Bill's opinions on slavery were already known. However, the others were interrogated about their participation in pro-slavery violence. They were ultimately left unharmed. They led Dutch Bill to the edge of Mosquito Creek, and Brown's two youngest sons, along with Thompson and Weiner, hacked him to death. The men in John Brown's group responded differently. Owen, who was normally stoic, wept for hours. When John Jr. and Jason heard of the news of the murders, they both denounced it, and John Jr. temporarily lost his sanity. John Brown simply insisted, quote, "God is my judge. It was absolutely necessary as a measure of self-defense and for the defense of others," unquote. While pro-slavery newspapers shrieked about abolitionist murders, the murders at Pottawatomie would prove to be only one instance of a rising tide of violence in the territory. A reign of terror began with outrages almost a daily occurrence, and many murders passed without notice. One witness noted pro-slavery atrocities, quote, "of brutal ferocity, from which the wildest savages might have shrunk with horror," unquote. Pottawatomie proved that abolitionists could respond to Southern violence and scared many pro-slavery settlers out of the Pottawatomie area. However, it did not much alter the course of violence in Kansas. Battles would rage in Kansas well into 1857, before the tide turned in favor of Free Staters, who won via the ballot. One of its main points of importance was on how it influenced the South's perceptions of abolitionists and their influence in the North. While Brown's actions were mainly anomalous among abolitionists, Southerners concocted a story where this was the planned action of a vast abolitionist conspiracy, hell-bent on bringing terror and war to the South. They attempted to tie Brown to the Free State political party and abolitionist leaders. These accusations were far from true. Brown had never been a member of any abolitionist political organization. However, it did foster Southern paranoia about a Northern conspiracy that would help spark the Civil War. It's important to note that while Brown was fighting pro-slavery forces, he was also fighting to protect Indigenous people from further incursion. While both Free Staters and pro-slavery settlers wanted to remove Indigenous tribes from Kansas, pro-slavery settlers were far more aggressive. Pro-slavery settlers dominated as Indian agents, who were white officials who dealt with Native people and stole large parcels of the finest land in the territory from tribes through shady dealings, confiscation, and violence. We've already seen how Brown interacted with Indigenous people, but fighting other whites to protect their rights is another matter. In the 1820s, while Brown and his family were living in Meadville, Ohio, tribes would frequently migrate to the area to hunt in the winter. John Brown usually welcomed them and supplied them with food and provisions. Other settlers felt differently. They approached Brown to help them in driving off the Native people, but Brown refused, replying to them, quote, "I will have nothing to do with so mean an act. I would sooner take my gun and help drive you out of the country," unquote. In Kansas, Brown immediately established friendly relations with the local tribes, such as the Sacs, the Foxes, and the Ottawas, who would frequently travel through the area of Brown's station and visit the family. One local tribe council enlisted the Browns to survey their territory in hopes it could help them protect their territory from pro-slavery settlement. Additionally, one of John Brown's closest allies in the area was John Tecumseh Ottawa Jones, who was a prosperous Indigenous farmer near the Browns. So now we get to the part where we see John Brown's exploits as a guerrilla leader with the battles of Blackjack and Osawatomie. But first, we have to see how a couple of Brown's sons got themselves in hot water. John Jr. and Jason left Brown's station to stay with their aunt and uncle, Florilla and Samuel Adair, where their wives had been staying. John Jr., who had grown increasingly disturbed, fled in the middle of the night to be captured in a ravine by a group of border ruffians, headed by Captain Henry C. Pate. Jason left the cabin after 2 days in search of federal troops he believed would give him protection. He was also captured by Captain Pates, who turned him over to federal cavalry led by Captain Wood. John Jr. would also be handed over to Captain Wood after suffering mistreatment and beatings from Pates's men. John Jr. would only become increasingly unwell as they were eventually force-marched 65 miles, chained together with other Free State prisoners, to a pro-slavery court in Lecompton to stand trial. At the trial, Jason was freed, but John Jr. was charged with high treason due to his record as a Free State politician. Jason returned to Brown's Station and found his family's cabins burned to the ground, so he made his way to his father's wilderness camp. At the end of May, Brown was contacted by Free State leaders who reported ruffians had been stealing horses and planning to attack local towns. Brown agreed to help protect them if they gathered volunteers from the local community. In total, they had 29 men, 20 volunteers along with 9 of Brown's men. While Brown and his men were at a religious service in the village Prairie City, the Missourians attacked. The men seized their guns and ran out immediately, capturing 3 invaders. Brown learned the force of Missourians, led by Captain Pate, was positioned at Blackjack, a boggy area near the town. While Brown was outnumbered with Pate's troops amounting to around 50, his men approached their position. While Pate's sentries noticed the approaching group, they sounded the alarm, reporting over 100 abolitionists were approaching. Brown took a position in a 10-foot ravine and exchanged fire. Brown saw some of his men had deserted and retreated to a nearby hill, so he instructed them to fire at the enemy's horses, which were soon decimated. The tide was turning to Brown, but the sudden appearance of his son Frederick sealed the victory. Frederick galloped across the battlefield on a horse, waving a sword, shouting, "Hurrah! Come on, boys! We've got him surrounded. We've cut off all communication." Frederick's bravado frightened Pate, who sent out a man to surrender. When Pate approached Brown to negotiate surrender terms, Brown made it clear he was only accepting unconditional surrender. He instructed Pate, whose troops had diminished to 23, to order them to surrender their arms. When Pate hesitated, Brown pointed a pistol at his head and said, "Give the order now," to which Pate complied. Brown took Pate and his men captive and treated them with clemency. He drew up a treaty that would free his captives in exchange for the release of his sons, John and Jason. Brown was upset when the federal cavalry arrived and assented to the agreement, only to liberate Pate and his men while delaying in releasing his sons. However, he was also fortunate the commander of the federal troops did not arrest him on his murder warrant. While the Battle of Blackjack had been odd, it bolstered Brown's legend. As a New York Times reporter noted, Brown had become the quote-unquote terror of all Missouri. He was given credit for anti-slavery actions he had nothing to do with, and was linked to the Republican Party, a party Brown actually detested for being weak on slavery. Brown would further advance his reputation with the Battle of Osawatomie, but we also need to put it into context. Pro-slavery violence had not slowed down. In a Leavenworth saloon in August of 1856, a ruffian named Fugert drunkenly made a bet that he could scalp an abolitionist within 2 hours. He found a Free State man in a carriage on a public road and scalped him with a Bowie knife. A Free State teamster was victimized the same way in a copycat crime that day. Adding to the flames, President Pierce infuriated Missourians when he appointed John W. Geary as Wilson Shannon's replacement as governor. To the consternation of Pierce and his successor, James Buchanan, Geary had shifted to the Free State side, and Missourians feared it would end slavery's chances in Kansas. Missourians and pro-slavery Kansas settlers declared an all-out war against abolitionists, hoping to exterminate their opponents before the new governor could arrive. Missourians amassed a large force on the border of the territory and pro-slavery Kansans formed a militia. They went on a killing spree, murdering any person they suspected of having Free State sympathies. Brown suspected that the town of Osawatomie would be attacked, and at a town meeting argued it could be defended using guerrilla tactics and natural defenses which others dismissed. In the lead-up to the battle, Brown raided a pro-slavery camp, appropriating clothing and cattle. He also captured several pro-slavery soldiers. His behavior shows something interesting about Brown. Outside of Pottawatomie, if Brown ever had captives, he normally treated them well and simply lectured them on the evils of slavery before releasing them. To these men he advised, quote, "You are fighting for slavery. You want to make or keep other people slaves. Do you not know that your wicked efforts will end in making slaves of yourselves? You come here to make this a slave state. You are fighting against liberty. Therefore, you are traitors to liberty in your country, of the worst kind, and deserve to be hung from the nearest tree. Go in peace. Go home and tell your neighbors and friends of your mistake. We deprive you only of your arms, and do that only lest some of you are not yet converted to the right." Unquote. On August 30th, a Missouri force of over 300, led by Major General John W.E.B, approached the town of Osawatomie. They planned to destroy Osawatomie and proceed to Topeka and Lawrence. On the road, they encountered Frederick Brown, who likely approached the Missourians defiantly, ignored commands to halt, and was shot down while reaching for his revolver. The Missourians also shot two neighbors who came out to investigate the noise. Brown was having breakfast when he heard the news of the Missourians' approach and his son's murder. Brown quickly commanded his men to prepare for battle. When asked for advice by a new follower who had not seen battle, Luke F. Parsons, Brown replied, quote, "Take more care to end life well than to live long." Unquote. When he reached Osawatomie, Brown had 38 men, meaning he would be vastly outnumbered. Brown and his men took positions in a heavy forest between the Marais des Cygnes River and the road the Missourians were approaching on. Hidden in the forest, Brown's men leveled significant casualties on the Missourians. Reed's force was thrown into confusion, and his horses bucked frantically, sending their riders to the ground. The Missourians returned fire with no result. Eventually, they did regroup and led a charge against Brown's men, who were overwhelmed and forced to scatter. Several of Brown's men plunged into the river and were either shot or captured. John Brown and his son Jason fled along the riverbank and crossed the river when they were out of shooting range. The Missourians went on to burn down Osawatomie. While watching the smoke rise, John Brown declared, quote, "God sees it," unquote, and told his son Jason, quote, "I have only one short time to live, one death to die, and I will die fighting for this cause. There will be no more peace in this land until slavery is done for," unquote. While Brown had lost the battle, he had killed at least 20 to 30 enemy soldiers and wounded another 40. But more importantly, Brown's reputation reached national renown. Ever the skilled propagandist, Brown wrote a widely read newspaper article about the battle, and a senator would later compare the battle to Thermopylae of 300 fame. Missourians planned another invasion and invaded Kansas with a force of 2,700. About 200 approached Lawrence, whose residents Brown helped prepare for battle. Fortunately, Governor Geary appeared on September 15th and ordered both sides disarmed. Geary declared amnesty for everyone involved in the Kansas violence. This was all good news for Brown, who no longer needed to worry about arrest and constantly fighting pro-slavery violence. This meant Brown could leave the territory and prepare for his ultimate objective, Harper's Ferry.
Thanks, Alex. That was excellent. So Jeremy and I have a few questions, and of course, we'd love to hear your thoughts on what you covered in this first part. One of the questions that both of us had was, John Brown's religion, his Calvinism, how did that shape his actions, whether that's his abolitionism, his support for anti-racism? What did Calvinism mean to John Brown, and how did it shape who he was?
So I think with John Brown, yeah, the Calvinism is like very central to his ideas and to like what he would go on to do. For anybody who doesn't really know about Calvinism, it was religion started by John Calvin, which is like very heavily focused on predestination. So obviously, I think we probably have all learned this from like school. Calvinism believes that like people are predestined by God to either be saved or not. It's also a pretty severe religion. So John Brown, what we see in him is that not only, as we kind of all know, he believed that he was like sent by God to fight against slavery, but also he had a very, like I said, severe interpretation of Calvinism. So one of his favorite figures was Jonathan Edwards Jr., who like had a very strong focus on like the total sovereignty of God and the powerlessness of human beings in face of that power. When you go through a lot of John Brown's letters to his family, he very much emphasizes that. He very much emphasizes how he's like this kind of lowly servant of God, and that everything, even like the bad stuff that happens to him, as you'll see in the narrative, is that these are things that like were determined by God, and that John Brown and his families kind of need to submit to it and realize that like what God has ordained for like a reason. And he kind of believes that in a lot of cases, like when he is in Kansas, he believes that like some of the pro-slavery violence that happens there, he believes it's like was sent by God in order to, I guess, sharpen the conflict there. He even says, I support some, I'm happy about some of the violence and stuff that's happening because eventually the pro-slavery foot will slip in due time. So he's kind of talking about how even like these kind of negative things he views as sort of tools that he can eventually use in the overthrow of slavery. He even believes that the Allegheny Mountains, which is where he decided he wanted to set up his maroon community, he believes that they were like sent there by God in order to end the abolition of slavery. So Brown is very convinced of God's hatred of slavery. And what we see, like one of his favorite phrases is God is no respecter of persons, which I point out in the narrative comes from the Acts of the Apostles. And it basically means that like God does not have favorites. God believes that everyone is equal, and God loves everyone equal in his sight. So John Brown is like very convinced of this. And basically what I consider most important about Brown in his religion is he really gives a prophetic witness, is what I like to say. Basically, he's like very kind of Old Testament prophet. God is a bringer of justice. And he believes that slavery is the ultimate evil that has pretty much ever existed on the earth, and that he is sent by God to help in any way that he can in its destruction. So I think, yeah, Brown really views himself as kind of like an Old Testament. So I think, at least I kind of view him as kind of a sort of an Old Testament prophet coming around saying that slavery is evil and that it needs to be abolished and ended in any way necessary.
You know, it's interesting because whenever someone who is like outside of the establishment of whatever era they might find themselves in reads the Bible and interprets it themselves, they have a very different read on it than somebody who is sort of being taught by the existing establishment. And I guess two of the major examples would be a lot of the peasant uprisings that took place in sort of the 16th century, the 15th century, the 17th century. They were guided by this Protestantism that sort of like emerged out of Martin Luther or whatever, but like also when they were there to sort of read into what the Bible says, they were like, wait a second, God is the ultimate authority. All of this other stuff that you put above us is none of that really is spoken about in the Bible. And then another example is the Diggers. So this would have been under Oliver Cromwell, right? During what they call the interregnum, I think, where there was no king in England. Cromwell was more or less a dictator, but what he wanted to do was modernize the British Army. And he did that by teaching average soldiers to read, because he thought, well, it's very inefficient and brittle the way that we have our structure right now, where only the officers who are aristocracy can read. And if something bad happens and one of them gets killed, no one knows what the battle plans are at that point. But if we teach all of our soldiers to read, then all of them can become familiar with the battle plans and they can execute them. What ended up happening, though, is that all of these soldiers were taught to read from the Bible itself. And a bunch of them were like, wait a second, the Bible here says that like the early apostles held everything in common and that their only master was God himself. And they established a commune afterwards. They were like, we're not going to listen to what any of you are saying. We're going to go ahead and like take this plot of land and we're going to work it in common and we're going to share everything. So it's like, it's fascinating to me that that is kind of the direction that people take when they, outside of whatever the established religious order might be, how they read the Bible is very different from how it is expressed to them by those who are in charge most often, I think.
So like first one when you're talking about is there's one in the Peasants' Revolt in the 1300s in England that was largely inspired by the preachings of a priest named John Ball, who was very famous in that country, and just he was kind of considered like the spark for it.
Yeah.
The revolt. And then also a big part of the context for John Brown's religion is the disestablishment of religion in the United States. So obviously there's no official church in the United States.
Right.
So as you're pointing out, like people are kind of able to read and interpret the Bible as they want. And that's kind of like a big thing, just like in the just general religious atmosphere of the time, is a lot of people are reading the Bible for themselves and kind of coming up with their own interpretations. A lot of times those are a lot more wacky than anything. But yeah, in this case, that's like a big reason why John Brown's able to do what he does, is because he's able to read the Bible himself and kind of come to his own conclusions about it.
Yeah, what I find fascinating, this is, I guess, a bit of a personal lore drop, but in university, Christian theology was my minor for my Bachelor of Arts.
Oh.
So I just love like learning about theology, talking about it, hearing about it, even though myself currently I'm not a Christian. But with that said, what I find interesting about John Brown's Calvinism being this kind of shining light for his progressive action is that, as you mentioned, Alex, Calvinism is typically seen as like a very severe and like harsh and strict interpretation of Christianity, in the sense that it's like, you know what, we are the predestined chosen by God, and everyone else is kind of like damned. So in that sense, it's almost like it's hard to envision a call to action for the people who, at least, through looking out around the world, are those who are damned versus those who are chosen. So I find John Brown's interpretation very striking in that context. And so, like, with that said, Alex, what are your thoughts on how John Brown's Calvinist beliefs kind of stood out from other Calvinists at the time? Like, were Calvinists generally pro-slavery, I'm assuming, during this time, as most Christians were in the U.S.? Could you shine some light on that for us?
So yeah, John Brown considered himself of old Puritan stock. So like that's kind of like what he said. It's pointed out in the narrative. He believed that he was a descendant from someone who came over on the Mayflower. But I can't really speak for the general Calvinist atmosphere, at least for Calvinists, at least, because a lot of Christians had kind of begun to move away from like Puritanism and Calvinism by the 19th century. So it's like less prominent. But I will say is that, yeah, most people in the United States at the time likely would have considered themselves Christian, right? And I would say that there's kind of a division around slavery. We think like a lot of Southerners, right, would consider themselves Christian, and they by the mid 1800s pretty much had built around this idea that slavery was approved and encouraged by God. But you have William Lloyd Garrison, who's also a Christian, an abolitionist, and like a lot of the abolitionists that appear in the Northeast, while they aren't Puritans and Calvinists like John Brown, they still have a Christian faith. So like Garrison considered himself a Christian perfectionist. So him and his cohort were very focused on non-resistance and non-violence. So his whole Christian perfectionism thing is an idea of like, well, we just need to set an example for others to follow. And once we do that, South will see it and they'll realize, wow, slavery is wrong and immoral and we should stop it. And I would say the Christians who consider themselves abolitionists would in large part kind of be in that line. So I would say the main difference between them and John Brown is John Brown's willingness to use force to end slavery. That's kind of like where I would say the biggest difference is. And also one thing about John Brown's faith that's different from everyone else's and a lot of other people's faiths is that his faith is actually not racist, and that most other abolitionists, even abolitionists at the time, still had pretty racist beliefs. And a lot of those would still be kind of steeped in Christianity, while John Brown's like explicitly that whole focus on God is no respecter of persons is kind of like what separates them. And we see like when he goes into a lot of the Western territories in Ohio, most of the other parishes and churches are still pretty racist. They still have segregated seating, which is something that John Brown resists when he goes there. And he's always very quick to remind people of that line, God is no respecter of persons. God doesn't care what race you are. And I would say that's kind of like the biggest difference between him and the other Christians around him, is that his faith is very much a focus on everyone is equal. The golden rule applies to everyone, and should not be any sort of separation between Christians or between anybody based on gender or racial status.
You actually preempted our next question, Alex, which was about this shared racism really between both pro-slavery and anti-slavery activists, I guess you could call them, during this time period. You mentioned the narrative. So it's John Brown's own personal experiences, his childhood experience of being friends with that enslaved Black child and seeing how harshly that they were mistreated. Were there any other kind of reflections he had like this throughout his life that you could speak to? Because it's just like, for me, it's always like hard to imagine what is the thing that made him think differently on this issue, if you can think of any other circumstance.
I mean, his upbringing, he was raised multiculturally. So, I mean, not only did he experience being around Black people, but like I point out, when he like moved to the Western Territory, when his family moved to Ohio as a child, they were largely surrounded by Indigenous tribes. The majority of people that lived in the territory were Indigenous. And he got a very quick lesson from his father, who, again, his father is like a very big influence in this, that you treat everyone equally. Like I said, the golden rule applies to everyone. Treat everyone as you want to be treated. And when they would interact with Indigenous tribes, they usually had a mutually beneficial relationship. So they didn't. So John Brown's dad, Owen Brown, believed that he was coming to the New World to help Christianize people, but he was planning on doing it through like example and collaboration with other people. So his approach to interacting with Indigenous people was cooperation. So John Brown like got a very good sense of this from like very early on, of like living with people that might be different from you and being good neighbors to them. So that was kind of like a big emphasis for his family as a child, is that no matter what other people, what other races, whatever their gender or whatever, you treat them like you'd want to be treated. I think that's kind of like the most like ingrained value that really shapes the rest of his life. And you see throughout the rest of his life too, is that he's not only anti-slavery, but he also makes a point of like living among the oppressed people that he's trying to serve as like equals. So we'll see like when he goes to North Elba to live there, he explicitly sets it up as a community to where Black and white people could live together as social equals. And unlike pretty much any other white person at the time, abolitionist or not, he would interact socially with Black people on completely equal terms. So the people in North Elba, the Black people that would come to North Elba would come to his house, eat dinner. He would go to their house, eat dinner, like that sort of thing. All sorts of things that no other white person in the country probably would have done. And most of them, even like white abolitionists, would have considered shocking. So it really is just the way John Brown lives his life, as viewing other people as equal and trying to interact with them as equals, that kind of like shapes his ultimate like abolitionism.
Yeah, I guess on the flip side, for the people who were, because you mentioned in the narrative how even abolitionists were like, oh, well, the Black people, they're very docile anyway. They can't be freed themselves. Like they cannot free themselves. We have to help them because they're not really built for this. That is race science, right? Like that is part of that whole racial categories were developed in the 18th century, like the late 18th century by Blumenbach, I believe is his name. But his perception of this was that we're only creating these classifications more or less arbitrarily. There's way too much similarity and overlap among people for them to be classified in a clear way. But people took these categories and ran with them. And it was, for instance, considered that Indigenous Americans could not be enslaved because their nature, quote unquote, was to be combative and they sought freedom above all other things, whereas Black people were like, they were made for slavery. So these are like commonly held beliefs around this time. It's like a result of the Enlightenment, for better or worse, where everything needed to be sort of scientifically classified, needed to be understood from like a biological essentialist perspective, because that was kind of the direction that was taken, which is a fallout of capitalism. I'm not going to get into the history of the Enlightenment, but like it is, all of this sort of follows on one piece after the other to lead to kind of the environment in which people who both hated slavery and loved it both thought the same thing about racial hierarchy, which is crazy, but I don't know. That was the commonly held belief at the time. Bonkers stuff.
Yeah, I would say like the common strain in white abolitionism at the time would be you could kind of compare it to Rudyard Kipling's White Man's Burden, where it's like they view it as their responsibility to free Black people or to free enslaved people because the enslaved can't do it themselves.
Right.
It's such like an important distinction to make, because the way that we often either see this in popular media or we learn about it in school is that it's like that there's a link between being like both anti-slavery and anti-racist. Like these are the same things, right? That it's like if so and so who we learn about in school fought against slavery, like he was progressive in the ultimate sense. But what that fails to explain, that kind of presentation of it, is then why does then Jim Crow follow right after all of this? Why does then Africa become colonized by these same European powers who were wanting freedom of some sort, right? So yeah, it's a very important distinction you made, Alex.
You'll see like when you're going back and reading like Black people's accounts of being in the North, they'll mention about how the North is essentially about as racist as they notice in the South. Is like they notice like some difference, but very little difference. They say that the experience is particularly pronounced when they go to like places in Europe where, at least on social matters, things are a little bit more equal. But also like when you notice like even the people who were going to Kansas territory, the Free Staters who were going there, they went there and opposed slavery, not because they wanted to help Black people or have Black people live on equal social terms, but because they didn't want Black people there at all. They wanted completely to prevent Black people from moving to the territory altogether.
Yeah.
So with that said, we're talking about John Brown living in, of course, the 1800s. He's, a unicorn in the sense that he's a white abolitionist who is both anti-racist in what he says and in his practices, etc. For me as a Black person growing up, part of like the history that you just kind of you take in, whether it's like from the community or even just like other spaces for books for Black people. I remember, this is, I think, a Scholastic, I got like a Scholastic book fair and it was like Black history A to Z kind of thing, right? And in that book, we learned about people like Shaka Zulu and Malcolm X, etc. So like in Black communities, my experience has been that there's a real emphasis on this kind of history of radicalism, even if it's not necessarily seen as being like, yeah, everyone needs to be like Malcolm X. It's like, Malcolm X exists and you should learn about him, even if we over here are liberals kind of thing, right? What is surprising to me, and I'm very, very much interested to hear what Alex and Jeremy think about this, is that when it comes to people like John Brown, I guess he's fairly well known in America. But let's move forward to the next century, the 20th century, the civil rights movement. There are all these white people who, against all expectation and all odds, are working and fighting in this Black freedom struggle, but we don't learn or hear about them. We don't know their names. Like I was asking Jeremy before we started, it's like, can you name one white person in the 20th century who wasn't a politician who fought the Black freedom struggle for Black American civil rights, right?
Yeah. And I was like, I could remember vaguely like that the Freedom Riders would cross over and protect polling locations, but I couldn't name a single one. And I am a person who actively seeks this sort of stuff out, but even I can't name a single one, which is crazy.
Yeah, so that brings me to my question is why isn't this history, this long-standing history, it's pretending like it's not there, but if you watch those, 60s black and white films of people walking at the marches, there's white people there, but we don't know their names. Why is this history kind of kept shrouded and hidden, and even including like people like John Brown. I'm sure there were other people like John Brown, but for whatever reason, they may not have gotten the same notoriety in both the North and the South. Why is this history obscured?
That was kind of hard. I don't have like a great answer for it, but I think you want to make sure it's obscured. If I'm a person in power, I want to make sure it's obscured because I want to make sure that all the people, like all of the working class and poor people or whatever, are all like fighting each other. I want to make sure that I erase any sort of examples of racial cooperation that challenges my power, because that's ultimately at the end of the day what scares me the most, is that I don't want the working class and other people and poor people to realize that they have a common struggle. So you want to make sure that you kind of like obscure and erase any sorts of examples of that. So it's even like why do most people not know about the Battle of Blair Mountain, which was the largest domestic insurrection outside of the Civil War, which was black and white coal miners fighting the oppressors and the mine owners. Largely because, yeah, like I said, if I'm a person in power, I want to protect my power, and I don't want people to realize that they have collective power and power in numbers and power in unity. So like, I mean, that's a big thing in terms of Southern history, is making sure to divide poor whites and black people in the South. So something that we like see during the Civil War and afterwards is that some of the most virulent and fiercest supporters of slavery and segregation are poor white people who don't have any really economic interest in owning slaves. Like the majority of white people in the antebellum South did not own slaves, but a lot of them still supported slavery because, well, what you see is that these white people who have pretty much nothing else in their lives, they have very little money, very little status. The one little bit of status that they do have is their status as white people. So they're going to fight tooth and nail to protect that, even if it means keeping other people down. So I think that's been a big factor of like control and division in the South for a long time, is that oftentimes politicians and large landowners and et cetera would make sure to play up these racial differences and make sure to encourage poor white people that if black people gained anything, that they will be taking it out of like their mouths, right? That, and a big thing about like civil rights movements is making people understand that if other people, black people gain rights, then poor white people aren't losing rights. It just means that black people also have rights. So I think that's a big part of it, is that just trying to keep that sort of unity and collective power at bay.
And I think it's even crazier though, because yes, of course, like that is the way it's framed, that if like it's a zero-sum game where if black people gain some kind of equality with white people will lose something, which they will in the vague sense of like white supremacy. But objectively, if you have an oppressed underclass, they are then forced into precarious situations which make them more desperate, which means that they will work for less money. And if they work for less money, you don't get a job. You are then competing with somebody. This is the same with undocumented immigrants, right? The United States needs both the people who want to build the wall, quote unquote, and the people who want open borders to both exist at the same time, because these two opposing viewpoints create precarity for people, because when they cross the border, they know they're not really supposed to be there. If the wall were like firmly there and anybody who got close to it got sent back to wherever they came from, then we would have no immigration at all. If we had open borders and people were allowed to freely move beyond, then they could work for full wages, and then we would have no sort of precarity for these people. But because we have both of these positions existing at the same time, it creates that situation where people work for less. This is the same with slavery, right? Slavery depresses wages because somebody is basically working for nothing. They're working for food and they're working for a place to stay, which is always shit. But that creates a situation where wages are artificially depressed for any people who live in that community. So like, I think the problem is that it is really just the mental concept of being superior to another person that drives these attitudes on race for white people, because they get to be a part of a group of people who are better than another group of people. It does not equate to an economic benefit in any meaningful sense, because while, yes, of course, you're going to get a job that pays better over somebody else, there are also depressed wages because this other person exists in an underclass. So it's like a weird White supremacy is fucking weird.
Yeah, and so that's what I appreciate, Alex, about you writing the totality of this narrative for this two-parter, right? Is as a Black kid growing up, I was always like, know your history, right? So that you can move forward in a way that's liberatory to your own and your community's interests. And so John Brown is the example of the white person who's radical in their liberatory pursuits for all those around him. And he's just, one an example of many that I think, particularly like white socialists, communists, should be learning about, people that they should be emphasizing. If there ever was, a case to be made for a White History Month, then I think it should include and focus on all of these white people who've been erased, who've been on the forefront of the Black freedom struggle, have been side by side with Black and brown people fighting the same fight.
Yeah, and that's why I think John Brown is like so important, because he does really give white socialists today kind of like a model of someone who showed complete solidarity with the oppressed and the people that he like wanted to serve. So he's just kind of like a good model of a person who looked around, saw the situation what he was in, and saw what he needed to do to change it. And he didn't like make any complaints or like try and get defensive about like his privilege as a white person. He just saw slavery was wrong. Black people are equal to white people, and I'm going to do whatever I can to change it. Not like getting defensive about like trying to ameliorate his own conscience. He focused on the action that needed to be done.
So before moving on to the next question, I did want to kind of throw out a recommendation for a reading. This is by Herbert Aptheker, who's I think, relatively well-known American communist historian. I believe he passed away in the early 2000s. He wrote a text entitled Anti-Racism in U.S. History, the First 200 Years. It is kind of hard to get a hold of. I believe it is on archive.org, but it does kind of give that early history of white involved anti-racism within what is today now known as America. So moving forward, we talked about, John Brown as the example for socialists today, white socialists today in America at the time, as John Brown is doing all this work in part one, as mentioned, that Marxist movement hasn't really come to fruition. Socialism as it exists currently in America in the early 1800s is what's known as a utopian socialism. How does John Brown interact or figure into this early period of socialism in the U.S., if you can address that?
So, yeah, I would consider Brown to be more in line with the kind of like a utopian socialist concept if we're going to kind of like see where he interacts. His son, John Jr., I think it's John Jr., would go on to become a socialist and a Marxist. But John Brown, while he definitely like showed a lot of sympathy towards workers in the struggle, I don't think he ever like fully would ever really identify himself as a socialist. So for like the context of the time, for like these utopian socialists, a big thing that most of them would do were like kind of breaking off not like regular society and kind of establishing their own like utopian communes that they tried to live on. And those were like very common in the first half of the 19th century. So Brown definitely would have known about that. And that's kind of like what North Elba was designed to be, as like sort of experimental society where Black people and white people live together as social equals. But Brown does demonstrate like concern for workers, particularly in one of the businesses he tries to run. But he believes that buyers of wool are cheating the producers, are cheating the farmers and the workers, and making like collaborating to get a lower price. Whether or not that's true or not, I don't really know. But he shows a lot of concern for how he believes that like growers and farmers are like poor farmers are being cheated for their wool prices. And he tries to establish this whole business around it where he would like try and find ways to get them better prices for their wool. In that way, he does like show concern, like a kind of an understanding of moving towards anti-capitalism, that these like large merchants and big businesses are able to exploit other people and workers. But I don't think he never like has a fully formed anti-capitalist or socialist idea, but he definitely has like inclinations towards that. And particularly one of the reasons that he does not succeed in business, he's a very bad businessman, was because he was basically too honest and did not like really work well in the capitalist atmosphere of the US in the early 19th century, largely because he's not willing to scam people. Although he does try his hand at some land speculation, he's really not good at it. So him as a businessman, just how he operates as a businessman kind of shows a sort of inclination towards socialist ideas, and that he refuses to do what capitalists normally do, which is kind of screw over other people and try and like get ahead. So yeah, I think that's like kind of where we see him like factoring in there. He's not necessarily a fully committed socialist or anything, but he has an inclination towards it.
What's I guess ironic a bit is if you look back at the pro-slavery advocates during this time, and I think we actually covered this in our One Big Blanket episode a few episodes back, where I read out a quote which was from one of these pro-slavery advocates in the American South in the early 18th, or I guess late 1850s, where he calls any person who is an abolitionist to essentially be like a closet socialist, because in their perspective, to say that a black and a white person are equal is essentially socialism as I understood it at the time, which is this kind of utopianism, and I guess even a creeping Marxism at this time as Marx is becoming more prominent. So I feel like he would have been tarred with that brush, so to speak, back then, regardless of even if he considered himself one or not.
Yeah.
So I can kind of see why someone might consider like any abolitionist a socialist, just because although that's far from true,
Yeah.
as we've kind of been pointing out, it takes away that division of the working class. At least it would have created the possibility of uniting between black and white workers, which was kind of hindered by slavery and having, I guess, like degraded wages. So yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no, exactly. And like I'm I guess using that quote in the sense that it's like this the same way today as Joe Biden is a socialist, right? In in the reactionary mindscape.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
With that said, Alex, were there any kind of like last comments you had about part one?
So we get part one does cover Pottawatomie
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
his actions at Osawatomie. So I did want to kind of comment on that. Like I point out in the narrative, it's really important when talking about like Pottawatomie and his actions in Kansas to put them in context. So they're in the context of increasing pro-slavery violence that is kind of being moved into the territory. And the men that John Brown ends up killing at Pottawatomie, the 5 people he kills, are all kind of part and parcel of that. So one of the men, Dutch Henry, who's one of the main people he's like going after, who he ends up killing his brother, William. But he is the owner of a tavern called Dutch Henry's Crossing, which is like a huge organizational, like basically a place where a rallying point for pro-slavery forces. And, Dutch Henry and his brothers basically threaten any sort of abolitionists who come into the area with murdering them or whatever. And so I think it's important to understand that Brown's actions at Pottawatomie are in kind of a response to this like increasing violence and this increasing violence that's going on with impunity. So a big part of it is at the time, Southerners would believe that abolitionists and Northerners were unwilling to fight, that they could basically go into Kansas and do whatever they wanted and not have to worry about any sort of like response. So you see that with like the sack of Lawrence. You also see it with Preston Brooks's canning of Charles Sumner on the Senate floor. So you kind of see this like this atmosphere of Southerners and border ruffians believing that they can essentially do whatever sort of violence they want with impunity. And John Brown's response to that is what he does at Pottawatomie is to try and answer to that. He's like saying, I can use Southern methods against them too, that they can't just kind of get away with doing whatever they want with impunity, that there's going to be a response. And that's kind of like the main thing that I want to emphasize about Brown's actions at Pottawatomie, because even in the rest of his life, even though he is committed to using force to end slavery, his actions at Pottawatomie are actually pretty anomalous. Usually, if he captured someone or took them hostage, he would just kind of like lecture them about how bad slavery was and just send them on their way. But in Pottawatomie, he's like trying to make a statement. He's trying to show to everyone that if Southerners want to act this way, we can do the same thing back.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. Like I'm assuming, that was used like there's too many historical, analogies, right? Where it's like where the violence of the oppressor is turned back on the oppressor, and then suddenly they have like a huge problem with violence at that point. When prior to that, they were like, whatever, it's the way we do things, it's the way things are, and then show that violence back to them, and they're like, oh my gosh, how could you do that? You're so terrible.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
So that about does it for this episode. Thanks so much to Alex, aka Southern Catholic Worker, and to all of our listeners and Patreon subscribers, the newest ones being Shannon Meek Misery, Hugs for Pugs, Robert S., Comrade Benjamin, John F., Jackson J., Mona L., Brian G., Zachary P., Jed SB, Dahlia, and History Will Absolve Me. And a very special shout out to our Vanguard patrons, Coop, Audie Gem, the Leninist Lawyer, B, Lil Lumpenprol, the Winking Cossack, Better Red Than Liberal, and Comrade Chihuahua. Once again, if you'd like to subscribe, you can do so at patreon.com/prolspod for free. If you have questions, comments, or episode ideas, please email us at prolspod@outlook.com. Please follow, review, like, and do all that algorithm stuff. And we'll see you in 2 weeks to finish our 2-part exploration of John Brown. May the specter haunt your streets in solidarity forever.
Forever.
Envision the entire world Sovietized communist style. Communist style. Communist style. Communist style. Communist style.
Stalin.
Soviet retro.
Communist style. Communist style.
Soviet retro.
Communist style. Communist style.
Soviet retro. Soviet retro.
Communist style. Communist style.
Soviet retro.
Communist style. Communist style.
Soviet retro.